Hi, welcome to our discussion about English for specific purposes pedagogy. In other words, what are the methods that you would want to use to be most effective if you're teaching English for specific purposes? Now, a caveat first, this is becoming actually one of my favorite topics that I present on. I've given maybe this presentation maybe 3 times. I give it different ways depending on the audience, but a lot of the material is the same. And the first time that I gave this presentation, a teacher actually, who was attending, said to me afterwards, "I'm a little confused. Everything you describe for how we should be teaching ESP, now that I think about it, shouldn't we be teaching general English the same way?" And I said, I think so. But the difference is that if we don't teach in this way, if we're teaching for a specific purpose for students, we won't be successful. And I think the student's right. I think if we apply some of these ideas to our general English teaching, we would be even more successful there. But what I want to do is to help you get a sense of the kinds of strategies, the kind of approaches, the methods that you would be using if you were to tackle a teaching of an English for specific purposes course and be actually successful. So, what I'm calling this lecture is Hung Up on ESP Pedagogy. I can, even from here, from the future, I can hear you laughing. Okay, so notice I've got a giant kind of ill-drawn hanger here. This is the way this makes sense to me. If you were to go to a general English class in Japan, university students, you might see them tackling a skill. And so everything would hang off of, say, reading. Or maybe if you were to attend in the U.S. an intensive English program class, you might attend one that's entire focus is grammar. Or you might observe one in which the entire focus is pronunciation. So whatever the focus is of a general English class, the entire focus of every ESP class should be language use situations. So in other words, what are the situations that you are preparing your students to participate in that they need English for? What is the English that they need for those specific situations? How do you get that information? Ideally, you get it through needs analysis. So you end up with this 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever the number is, language use situations that your students, they need to be able to participate and be successful in English. And that's what everything in ESP pedagogy hangs on. This is the entire focus. And so that's why this metaphor comes to mind for me. Now, one thing to think about, though we tend to think of language use situations as listening and speaking, like a hotel front desk person talking with a customer or a waitress talking with a customer at a restaurant, it can also be reading and writing as well. So maybe you are working with business people, and part of what they need to be able to do is to read emails that come into them that are complaints and respond accordingly, politely, efficiently, successfully, that kind of thing. So reading and writing responses to complaint emails, those would be language use situations. Probably the teacher actually would break them into 2. Reading them and then writing your responses. They're kind of 2 separate things. So that is everything that I'm going to talk about. Now there's a caveat here, and that is if we were to get up right now and travel to see an ESP class in action, there's a very good chance we would not see this approach to the teaching of ESP. because a lot of ESP teaching around the world is just general English teaching. It's got a different title, and students are told they're being prepared to go into business or to be successful in tourism or whatever, but really they're just getting general English. The focus is reading, or the focus is writing, or the focus is whatever, but it's not language use situations. So if you walk into an ESP class and the focus of the class is not on a language use situation, it's not really a real ESP class, no matter what the title is. Okay. So when I think about language use situations, and we know that we arrive at them ideally from our own needs analysis or from needs analysis that was done before us, that will then be the focus of a syllabus. And so the syllabus is that document that's kind of the roadmap of where we're headed in our course together. Whether that's meeting 4 weekends, or that's meeting every Thursday night, or it's meeting Monday through Thursday for an hour, whatever that is a roadmap. So one thing you need to know about a syllabus for ESP, it should always be entirely focused on language use situations. And so the way it's organized should be focused around that, okay? So if you believe you need to work on pronunciation with your students, the only reason it should show up on your syllabus is because it directly relates to one or more language use situations that they need to carry out, okay? And another thing to know about the syllabus, while we're talking about the syllabus, is when you prepare a syllabus for anything outside of ESP, it is expected that the syllabus is a binding document. It will not change. That you know what you need to know about the students going into the class, and that they can count on the syllabus staying the same. With ESP, best practice is that you remain nimble and flexible with your syllabus. Of course you need to do your homework ahead of time. Actually, you've got more homework to do before you teach an ESP class than a regular class, because you need to do needs analysis as much as you can get your hands on. But you don't know everything that you need to know in the first week of the class. So it's suggested, even if you create a fairly complete syllabus, you've come up with these 5 language use situations that students need English for, and you create your syllabus designed around those 5, that you remain flexible. It might be, as you get to know your students, that there's actually other ways that are even more important, significant, imperative, that they have to communicate in English that you didn't even know about in the beginning. So one way that an ESP syllabus is different than a general English syllabus, it's nimble, it's flexible, and it's likely to change. And in fact, if your course plan doesn't change in some way because of you're getting to know your students, you might be doing something wrong with ESP, because that means you're not listening enough, you're not taking in enough information, or perhaps you're not flexible enough or approachable enough to your students to make changes. Okay? And so be open to new information about language use situations that are coming in, and make sure that your syllabus is designed around them, whether that's 1, 2, 5, 10, whatever they are, language use situations. So when we think about what you actually do in a class and what's highly important that you do, one of the first things that you do, let's say you're planning a class meeting, of course it's around one of the language use situations. Maybe in this class meeting you can tackle the entire thing, or maybe in this class meeting you're just going to tackle one part of a language use situation. You need to have a clear goal for every class meeting that's directly related to the language use situation. And the second thing is, besides having one, you need to tell your students what it is. Most people around the world who are teaching ESP are teaching adults. A lot of people teaching ESP around the world are teaching what's called occupational ESP, which means when the students get up and leave your class, they go to work in the occupation. They are actually working. So with adult learners, it is always important to make sure they know what the goal of a lesson is. I would say for ESP, that's times 100. With every lesson, you need to make sure that your students know what the goal is. You might even make it part of your classroom routine, besides having it on the board. If they're strong readers, sometimes when I'm working with students in Nicaragua, they're not strong readers. Putting it up on the board doesn't always help. In fact, it might kind of bring up some frustration and anxiety. So whatever way you want to express it to them, then maybe having them give it back to you. What do they understand the goal to be? If it comes back in student language, not your language, better yet, now you're getting a better sense of what it means to them. So make sure that you have a goal for every class meeting that directly relates to a language use situation. Make sure that you state it to the students and make sure that they understand it. And we're going to come back to goal in a bit when we get to assessment. Now, for the next two pieces I have here are grammar and pronunciation. I would say grammar and pronunciation for a lot of general English teaching is the focus of the class. That's what teachers spend their time on. There's nothing wrong with grammar. There's nothing wrong with pronunciation. But you can see that the focus of this entire thing is language use situations. Grammar and pronunciation only show up when needed. Grammar and pronunciation only show up when needed. If there's really nothing much to say about grammar, students aren't struggling in any way, it doesn't have any new grammar for them, there's nothing that you feel like you could exploit to help them understand, then you don't need to say a word about grammar, right? Pronunciation. If your students aren't struggling with pronunciation in any way, or there aren't any tricky sounds that are coming up, or there aren't any elements of what they'll have to say that you think they'll need some fluency work on so that they can say them more quickly, reduce sounds, kind of jumble sounds together the way we do in English as we become more fluent, then really there's nothing to say about pronunciation. Grammar and pronunciation only show up in ESP when needed. Now that I've said that, so that you don't automatically assume that they need to show up in what you do, now that I've said that, you need to know that you do need to teach grammar and pronunciation when they are needed. It does need to be part of what you do. And I would say pronunciation especially, because for a lot of learners, not everyone, but for a lot of learners, if they aren't absolutely sure about how to pronounce something, they don't feel confident in saying it. And if they don't feel confident in saying it, they don't. And so now you have a student who's not able to participate in the language use situation that you are preparing them for, you're supporting them with. So for a lot of students, pronunciation really is key. When you're teaching pronunciation, make sure to use everything you can that's visual, everything you can that's physical, everything that you can, like a metaphor, to help them make sense of it. If when they say a sound, they're putting their tongue far back and it needs to be more forward, bring a diagram with you, if you can, of a tongue back, a tongue forward. With your hand, show your tongue is far back. I need it to be forward. So show in any way. Make it physical. If students, when they speak in that language use situation that they're producing, if they're speaking with all their syllables the same, they are speaking like this. The problem is that a native speaker of English is going to be listening for that stress, that word stress, that sentence stress. And so you would need to work with them on pronunciation, and a way to support that would be by clapping. Like if they need to be able to say, what would you like tonight? What would you like tonight? Getting them to clap along with the beat, okay? So grammar and pronunciation, they're not going to automatically show up in your lessons, only when needed, but when needed, they're needed. You really need to cover them, okay? Another aspect that shows up in your teaching and you need to include is strategies. Especially if you're teaching occupational ESP, that means that if your class gets out at 5, students may end up needing to use this at 6. Give them anything that they can hold on to make sense or to express their meaning. So for example, if you're working with hotel workers and they all at times need to, at the front desk, have guests at the hotel fill out something, then you could get them to support their meaning when they say, please fill this out, giving the client, the guest, the piece of paper they need to fill out with the pen. Even if they are saying it completely flat, please fill this out, which isn't going to be as clear to a native speaker or a native-like speaker as please fill this out. Then if they're supporting what they're saying with the physical objects, or if there's something they can point at, or if they can gesture, whatever strategies they could use to help express their meaning, that is a really powerful thing that you need to include. So even though grammar and pronunciation may not show up in every lesson, I would fully expect you to be encouraging, teaching, emphasizing, suggesting strategies with every lesson. So getting them to think about what could they do at this point in talking with someone if they didn't understand, and reminding them of what they can say. Could you repeat that again? Could you speak more slowly? What was that? Or restating it back to the person to see if they truly understood. So build in those strategies that will help them when maybe an hour later after your class they are in that language use situation. Another thing I have written here, it says professional knowledge. Professional knowledge. One way that ESP just differs dramatically from other areas of English is you will actually need to be thinking about the professional knowledge, the professional understanding that someone in that career, in that area would be able to apply. And part of what you'll be doing is you will be using your native-like understanding of English-speaking culture or native understanding of English-speaking culture to know what do native English speakers expect in this situation? What would they expect to hear? What would they need to answer their question, that kind of thing. Here's an example of a moment where I realized this in my own teaching. I was guest teaching in Nicaragua. I was working with a class that was both hotel workers and restaurant workers. So it wasn't as focused as, as optimal, but it was pretty focused. And it was completely occupational. All of them would get up from the class and go immediately to work afterwards. And so, one thing that the students had mentioned that they wanted to talk about is how to respond to complaints or problems that would come up for guests. They wanted to know, what do we do? What do we do? What do we say? And what are they even saying when they're telling us about a problem? So I came up with a series of activities, and I was co-teaching with the regular teacher. We came up with a series of activities around this, but one piece of professional knowledge that I shared with the students that they were a little surprised about and this took place in the context of Nicaragua, I shared that if I'm a guest at a hotel and I come up to the front desk and I tell them that my remote control won't work, or the TV won't work, or there's water on the floor of the bathroom, or whatever the problem is, or it smells in the room, that I would automatically expect the person listening to me to say, "Oh, I'm sorry about that," even though they obviously didn't cause the problem. The problem does not, they don't own the problem, right? But that's just rhetorically what I would expect to hear. So that's an example of a piece of professional knowledge that I shared with them from the perspective of having access to what would an English-speaking guest probably expect at this point. So I shared that with them, and that became a part of what they were producing in our role plays that we carried out. So part of the burden you bear when you are teaching students language use situations is you're also bearing the burden of knowing what would someone who's a predominant English speaker, what would they expect in this situation? What would politeness look like to them? And making sure that you're teaching that to your students so that they have that level of service as well. When I was guest teaching in Nicaragua, I mentioned that the main speaker of the class, the main teacher of the class, his name was Rodolfo. And one thing that he shared with me is that the focus of an ESP class really is to raise the level of service, raise the level of activity of what an employee is able to do. And that's not just English. There's other pieces in there too. There's understanding the profession better, so whenever you can share that, do that. And there's understanding the perceptions that guests or clients or customers might have. And so I think that's a kind of a nice example to help you understand one moment where I taught some professional knowledge to students, ESP students. Another aspect of ESP pedagogy, I have here social interaction. And best practices in ESP are when what happens in the ESP classroom looks like what happens when the students are workers outside, when they're working in the profession. So what do I mean by this? Let's say that you are you're hired to work with people, business women and men, and as you carry out a needs analysis and you get to know what it is that they need to do in English, you realize that most of the conversations that they need to take part in English happen where there's 3 or 4 people in a group. And often they're trying to solve a problem. So let's think about this for a moment. That means that for your ESP class time, let's say you get them every Thursday night from 5 to 8. The bulk of the time that the students are with you in your classroom, it should look like students in groups of 3 and 4 trying to solve problems. And you probably would have those language use situations kind of broken up a little bit. Maybe there's different kinds of problems. Maybe one language use situation is they've already got the pieces to the answer, they just have to put it together. Another language use situation is they've got the problem figured out, now they need to express it to a boss. So how are they going to do that, and who's going to express it? So, but you get a sense from this one, another way, a significant way that your ESP classroom needs to look drastically different from what a general English classroom looks like. Because if you were to walk into, especially English as a foreign language classrooms, if you were to walk into an EFL classroom, a general English classroom especially, what you would see, you'd see me or someone like me at the front of the classroom lecturing for the entire time. So it's entirely focused on the teacher, And the way the social interaction happens is students sit as a group, they're silent, they listen. If they do talk, it's only when the teacher directs them to. The teacher calls on them, or they raise their hand and the teacher calls on them from that. ESP must not look the same way. It cannot look like a traditional classroom. Otherwise, you will not be successful in getting the students where you need them to be with language use situations. Because if you think about it, if you set up your ESP class as a traditional class where you talk and they listen and they take notes, that's the social interaction you are setting them up for. So, will they be able to work well in groups of 3 and 4 when they need to solve problems? No. But if their director of their business, the owner of them, or the manager, gives a lecture to the group, they'll do great with that. They can take in that information. So think very carefully about how you set up the social interactions in your classroom and make sure that most of the time it matches up with the reality. So when I was working with the hotel and restaurant workers as a guest teacher in Nicaragua, most of the hotel workers ended up having a one-on-one interaction with guests. So I had front desk people, and they were one-on-one, working with guests who were checking in or checking out. I had restaurant workers who were taking an order. Even if it was a group of people, they were talking with one person at a time. So we designed the classroom around one-on-one social interactions. Yes, part of the time I was giving information, part of the time Rodolfo was giving information. Most of the time, they were one-on-one situations. So if you would have walked in, flew to Nicaragua, found your way to our class, peeked in the door, chances are you would have seen pairs working together, or you'd see us in role plays and students waiting to take their role in that role play. Okay? So a quick word, too, about social interaction is one way you might think about that social interaction is at the beginning of the class, after you've stated the goal, you're giving students the information that they need for that, and then they're doing a little bit of practice, right? They're doing a little bit of practice, trying it out. I suggest that you have that set up in the social interaction. Maybe you're coming back together, you're giving them feedback, and then they're actually using it. So now, for example, what I did for the students who wanted to work on how to respond to a problem, we came up with a front desk area, and we had people playing the role of front desk person, and then I handed out cards with problems that often people have at hotels. And each of the students who was waiting to talk with a front desk person, they had a problem. It was up to them to remember or to seek out from others what that problem meant, and we'd already talked about that. And then they needed to get a solution. They needed to get that across to the front desk person and get a solution, and then report on that solution. So whether you're practicing towards the beginning of the class meeting or you are actually using the language towards the end of the meeting, most of your class meeting time should be spent in the social interaction pattern that the students actually are going to be using English in, not whole class listening. Okay, assessment. If assessment is something that you kind of struggle with, you don't quite understand, you feel like it's slippery and you can't quite get your grips on it, it might be that this might be a step in a direction of you having a sense of it. Remember how I said that you needed to have a clear goal related to a language use situation. You needed to state that to the students and make sure they understand it. That's what your assessment is for that class meeting. Maybe the language use situation is to take a customer's order in a restaurant. That's the language use situation that relates to what your students need to be able to do. And maybe your goal for that lesson is to have students listen for keywords and be able to write them down, the keywords about the foods that are being ordered. So to be able to hear those keywords and successfully write them down. Then what would you be doing for assessment? You would be directly assessing that goal. Now let's go back. If that were the goal, then you would probably have students in pairs, and you would have one student playing the role of the waiter or waitress, and the other person playing the role of the customer at the restaurant. And so what you might do for assessment is, everyone who is sitting down, they are playing the role of the customer, you might slip each of them 3 cards of things that they are going to say that they're going to order. So you know what those 3 are, and the person listening to the order has a piece of paper and they're writing it down. It could even be incredibly informal. No one's handing anything in. You are walking around with your checklist, seeing for each student who took that order, did they get all 3 correct? Did they get 2 correct? Did they get 1 correct? Did they get 0 correct? Okay, so that would be the assessment. I suggest that you don't think about assessment as you probably are at this point. Quizzes, tests, something written down. I want you to think, when you think of ESP, assessment goes back to that class meeting's goal. Finding out if they can do it, or finding out where on the spectrum they can do it. So if you give each guest 3 things, how many of the 3 were they able to get? 100%, 66%, 33%, 0%. And you can just walk around with your checklist, checking off who's able to do what. Here's one thing about ESP. If you are working, for example, with a group of people in business, and you've been hired by a company to do that, as you're leaving class that night, if you're stopped by the manager and the manager says, what was your goal tonight for tonight's lesson? You need to be able to state what that was. And if the manager says, can they do it? You need to be able to say that. Actually, you might say, X, Y, and Z in the class did it 100%. These 3 students were able to do it mostly, and these 3 students were not able to do it yet. You need to be able to say, where are students? And remember, assessment tells you what next, right? If you do that exercise and everyone taking those orders is able to get one of the 3, you've got some work. And probably your next class meeting or one of the next needs to go back, recycle this, and give them more strategies. Maybe what they're struggling with is the reverse of pronunciation, being able to hear those words. So you could do some quick practice activities where you show students what to listen for, you put them into pairs, and you have them say randomly some of these words to each other and see if the other one can hear them, if they can notice them and write them down. So assessment is a really key thing, and it's all tied to goals. And in ESP, it's hardly ever a test, it's hardly ever a quiz, at least ideally if you're teaching best practices like I'm suggesting that you do. Another thing I have up here, it doesn't particularly belong in any particular place, so I just kind of tucked it at the end. But one thing that I want you to know is that if you were to visit a general English class, especially one that's overseas, it is very likely that what you would be exposed to is a teacher lecturing, and then at best, some practice of language. Now, what's the difference between practice and use? Practice is when you are simply wrapping your lips around words. You're getting them out there. You are practicing writing something. you are reading the same text that everyone else is reading, and you're looking for answers to it. And so practice is when everybody has the same information, and the only reason that we are talking with each other or we're interacting in any way is just to get a little practice, right? But we don't really need to. If we fall asleep in class, no one else in class is going to have a problem with that except maybe the instructor. But overseas, it's actually quite often people fall asleep in class. Now, here what I'm talking about is use. I'm suggesting immediate use. Use is when you don't know what your partner is going to say. You need to listen carefully. You don't have all the information. Your partner has some information, you've got some information, and you need to talk with each other. Like, for example, back to the taking an order. Maybe with the taking an order exercise, you are giving the restaurant guests, you're giving them some foods that they need to order. And the person taking the order, the only way they can find out what these are is by asking. But also, the person who is taking the order, they know some ways that the menu is a little bit different. Maybe there's another soup today, or maybe the hamburger on the item, one of the items, a hamburger, is not actually being offered today. So they've got some information too. Whenever students need to actually talk in class to get something done, to get an order taken, or to create something, or to find a solution, that is use. Now, in most classes, they start out with some kind of lecture, and then there's practice, and I'm putting a line here. I have been in a lot of classrooms where use never even shows up. And this is not ESP. Well, actually, I have been in ESP classes in which this happens. But the typical classroom, not the models that I'm exposing you to through your practicum, but a lot of other classrooms, teachers focus on giving information and then having students recite it back and forth. So, for example, students are given a partner, and they both have the same reading, they both have the same set of questions, they need to answer them. Do they really need to talk with each other? No, they don't. There's nothing to be gained by it. One of them could fall asleep and they'd still get them answered. And so I would say that a lot of classes that I'm in, at the very least, 75% of class time is taken up with lecture and practice. And what I'm saying here is I'm suggesting that you shoot for 75% of your time in an ESP classroom, students are actually using it. Shoot for that. If you hit 50%, you'll still be effective. But if possible, try to find ways to make that 75% of the time in your classroom. So again, if I walk into your classroom, if I walk into your ESP classroom, what kinds of things would I expect? I would expect that everything you're doing is around a language use situation that either you found out through your needs analysis, someone else found out from a previous needs analysis, or your students have asked you to carry out. You would be stating that goal to your students. You'd be making sure that they understand what that goal is. You would be dealing with grammar and pronunciation only as needed, but when they're needed, you would be covering them. You would be teaching strategies throughout the class meeting, reinforcing them whenever possible, giving them anything that they could use. And one beautiful thing about ESP, especially occupational ESP, you can actually go out into the work environments and see what it is that their work environments are like. You may notice some strategies, some things that they could use to make meaning or to understand that you wouldn't know unless you visited the context. So reinforce those strategies whenever possible. Whenever you can share with them some professional knowledge that will help them be a better employee, better in the profession, share that. Make that a part of the lesson. Just like Rodolfo said, if someone's taking an ESP class, they want to be better in their job. Help them be better in their job, even in addition to English whenever possible. Social interactions, I would expect that when I walked into your classroom, that whatever groupings you have students in, that's probably the way they are using English out in their work environment, and that it would match up with the language use situation. If the language use situation that day is how to take an order from a customer, I would not expect to walk in and see you addressing the whole class in a whole class experience, at least not for a significant part of the class. I would expect students to be in pairs. I would expect you to carry out informal assessment at the end of every class so that you know how close to your goal did you get. Did you meet it? And if not, who still needs work and what kind of work do they need? And I would expect that you would give students some information they need. You would provide some practice, whether that's pronouncing a certain word, whether that is fluently saying some sentences in past tense and getting that ED sound in there, whatever that is, but you would be spending as much time on use and as fast as possible to be going to actual language use. So that is best practices in a nutshell on a hanger on how to teach ESP. And I do think that there's some wisdom in what that conference attendee said to me when he said, you know, now that I think about it, I should probably be teaching my general English class this way as well. Okay, I hope that helps clarify for you and that you have a really nice, clear sense in your head of the direction to go when you're teaching an ESP class.